Well, welcome back, and thank you for joining us for the seven letters to the seven churches. And as I said in our first session, I thought it would have been a bit of a shame if we'd hung out with Revelation without going all the way back to have a look at what we would describe as scene one and have a chance to view these remarkable seven letters that were sent to the seven churches of Asia. So in each of these sessions, we're addressing one of them, and today we're going to look at the letter that was written to the church in Smyrna. We talked about the context for this letter, or these series of letters rather, and what we've seen in chapter 1 and verses 12 to 16 is this incredible vision of the king. He's pictured as both the Son of Man, which links him to our world and our experiences, but he's also seen as the one who is the Ancient of Days, the one who is forever. So we see both the everyday and the eternal are found in Jesus. He is both the one who has perfected humanity, but also complete divinity in that sense. We're introduced to the intensity of his facial expressions, his eyes, his voice, and all of it is so overpowering that John is overwhelmed completely by it. But even though you have that wonderful sense of intensity, there's also a sense of welcome. There's no need to be afraid in the presence of this great and awesome and mighty and all-powerful King. He is the one who holds the seven candlesticks, which symbolize the churches, the seven churches. He is the one who stands in the midst of them, holding those disconnected churches together, disconnected through persecution and the inability to relate and to connect with one another at that particular time. Each of the churches has an angel, which is symbolized by the seven stars, each of the stars representing an angel, and therefore each church has a guardian overseer, an angelic overseer. So let's wait again to hear what the second letter that was written to the seven churches is saying to us. Let me read for you today Revelations chapter 2 and verses 8 to 11. To the church in Smyrna. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. I quickly wanted to add that Smyrna, of course, is a city and not a vodka, for those of you who understand where I'm coming from on that. Smyrna, of course, has an interesting history. 700 years earlier, Smyrna as a city had been utterly destroyed. So by the time that John of Patmos brings this message to it, it was a city that had been rebuilt. It was a very beautiful city. It was a purpose-built city. It was brand sparkling new. And of course, because it had been designed as a complete city, it had a very natural harbour, a safe harbour, and therefore a great and prosperous trading system. It was very much seen as a place of culture. The city that was dead in 200 BC was now alive and had undergone, if you like, a resurrection in that sense. It was founded around about 1000 BC, and in 600 BC it had been destroyed by Alotes II, who was the king of Lydda at that time. Around 200 AD it was rebuilt by the Romans, and so the imagery there is of a city that once was dead but is now alive, and of course that resonates with the experience of the one who is speaking to the church. He too was once dead but now is alive. So you can see the link that is being made there. In Roman times, Smyrna was considered to be the most brilliant city of Asia Minor, successfully rivaling Pergamon, as we're going to move on to see the letter to Pergamon in a moment in our next session, and of course the great city of Ephesus. Its streets were wide and paved. Its system of coinage was old, and now around the city people continue to find relics which include coins of every period. It was celebrated for its schools of science and medicine, and of course the fact that it had such handsome buildings. Smyrna was one of those places that everyone wanted to visit because of its link with culture and with philosophy. It was a place of much debate, a place that people loved to visit. Just above the city, on the slopes, there was a theatre there that seated around about 20,000 spectators. And of course then, as with all these great cities, it had its temples. One that was a temple to Zeus, and it was often said that some of these temples were some of the greatest in any ancient city. So when we come to the introduction of the message here to the church in Smyrna, we're introduced to the one who is described as the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. And what we're seeing here is an eternal concept. We're not being shown something that is about Christ at one time being the first and ultimately he will become the last, nor are we being told that originally Christ was the Alpha and one day he's going to become the Omega. The truth is that Christ is the first and last, the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, all at the same time. So we're dealing with a time sequence that is very much beyond our own understanding of time. It overlaps in that eternal sense. So we're introduced to the one who is eternal and forever, the one who spoke the very first word of creation, and of course he will be the same one who will have the final word as our world merges into the next. We know very little about the church in Smyrna. It would seem very likely that it was Paul the Apostle who began the church there. One of the Apostle John's students, Polycarp, who apparently lived in the city from around about 69 to 155 AD, is thought to have played quite a major role in leading the church during the 2nd century. Tradition tells us that he was martyred in Smyrna. But what we do discover about this church here is some of its great qualities. On the surface, this church was the very opposite of Ephesus. The church in Ephesus seemingly was quite powerful and strong, the mother church, the center church, which all other churches look to. Smyrna, in contrast, even though it was in this great city of culture and vitality and trade, appears to be a church that was quite impoverished, a church that you could say almost was malnourished. It had all the physical signs of something that really was not going to get through to the end of the day. It's almost as if you sense this church is coming to the end of its time. It's on its last legs, as it were. To all extents and purposes, this is a church that is almost dead, and worse is yet to come. More persecution is about to hit it. Yet it is a church that will spring back into life. And the reason why is the opposite to what we saw in the church in Ephesus, is that this was a church that was rich in what truly matters. In verses 9, we have a little phrase which is repeated twice. It's the simple phrase, I know. And there's nothing worse than perhaps talking to somebody about a problem that we have, and they keep saying, I know, I understand, when in fact, you know they don't understand. They haven't experienced it for themselves. They mean well, but you want to scream out, no, you don't get it. You've not been there. You don't know how it feels. Well, what we're being told here in verse 9 is that Jesus does know how it feels. I know, not just in the sense of knowledge, but in terms of empathy. Jesus too has experienced suffering and persecution and ultimately death. But out of that, of course, comes resurrection. And that's what's going to happen for this church. Like the great city in which it's located, which had been dead but was brought back to life, so this was a church that is almost on its last legs. It seems as though it's about to evaporate, to come to an end. This is a church that will burst back into life. It will experience resurrection. And so Jesus is saying, I know how it is. I've been there. I've overcome. And if you maintain your faith, you too will overcome. This will be a church filled with overcomers. But it must resist the temptation to throw in the towel. It must remain faithful to the faithful one. This is a church like the city in which it's located, and the Jesus whom it loves and serves, that will rise again in power. And of course, all churches must be communities of the resurrection. In verse 9, we're also told that this is a church which is afflicted. The Greek word here is thalipsis. And what that word really means is intense stress and strain. It's almost as if the church is being pulled, almost ripped apart by what it's facing. It's tough and it's hard for this church. This is a church that is under intense pressure. And there are a number of reasons why this church is under such pressure. It's simply because it's being slandered. Things are being said about this church that simply are not true. Those who are saying it want it to be true, but the reality is it's not true. The first accusation made against this church, as indeed it was made against many of the early churches, is a complete misunderstanding of what we now call communion or the Lord's Supper. During the meal that they shared together, they would remember the body broken through bread and the poured out blood of Jesus through wine. And what had happened was that there were those who wanted to stir up people against the church, who said this: you know, those Christians, you know what they're doing? They're drinking blood. Where do they get the blood from? And so the rumours began to spread that Christians were people that drank the blood of others. The second accusation made against them was a complete misunderstanding of what was known as the love feast, or the agape feast. That was a feast which brought the church together, during which they, as I've already said, celebrated together and remembered the Lord's death through bread and wine. Of course, in a city that was known for its lax sexual behaviour, as soon as anybody said, oh, we have an agape feast, we have a love feast, everyone assumed that it was some kind of orgy, and therefore the church was being slandered in that way too. The third area was this: often when people became followers of Jesus, maybe they were a member of a household, as they would have been, of course, maybe one of them had become a follower of Jesus, then the very fact that they had become committed to Jesus was seen as a betrayal of their culture, their family values, their family religion and philosophies and understanding. And so Christians at that time were accused of breaking up families, destroying the family unit. And of course, the family unit was considered to be very important, very precious, which of course it is. And finally, they were being slandered about their claim to loyalty and to the lordship of Jesus. At that time, Caesar was Lord, and therefore to say that Jesus was Lord was a betrayal of both the emperor as well as the empire. So they were seen as traitors, people who had sold out on the essence of emperor worship, the worship of Caesar. And so they were ostracized for that reason. So you can see all of this put enormous pressure on the church, stress and strain. It was constantly under pressure in that sense. And those that were accusing the church of these things, well, they hid behind the cloak of all of this. Of course, ultimately, they simply hated Jesus, but they tried to cover it over in a way that it looked much more acceptable to people, that there were good reasons why they hated these Christians and wanted to put them in prison and to do away with them. And of course, the fear of prison at that time for any Christian believer was of course linked to the fear of death. Mostly, people, when they were put in prison, the ultimate outcome, of course, was execution. Let's think about the characteristics of this church. This was a church that is being told here is about to be brought through a time of persecution, but not out of persecution. And that's tough. That must have been tough for them to hear. And I guess that shows the depth of their commitment to Jesus. They weren't put off by that. They trusted Jesus to take them through this difficult period. They understood that Jesus was not going to take them out of it. This was a church that was materially poor, but was rich in all the important things. This was a church that was truly storing up treasure in heaven. And of course, because of that, their love for Jesus and their love for each other was always increasing. Again, the opposite of what we've seen with the church in Ephesus. And whatever they face, we're told, they will ultimately win the crown of life. They will receive the crown of life. I guess the image here is, of course, of the games which all these cities had in their great theatres. Games where the winner, whether it was an athletic event or whether it was jousting or fighting or whatever it was, wrestling perhaps, the winner would always have a crown put on their head. And what the believers are being told here in Smyrna is that they will receive their crown, even though in human terms they seem to be the losers, even though in human terms they seem to be the ones who have lost. They've been defeated. Ultimately, in eternal terms, they are the victors. They are the ones who will receive the crown of life, the crown of eternal life. Their place with Jesus will be secure and is secure forever. Of that they can be absolutely certain. And they will go through times of testing. Here we're told that there will be a period of 10 days. I guess again, that's not to be taken in a literal sense. It simply represents two things. Firstly, it's a short period. And secondly, it's a period that will not go on forever. And so in that sense, what they're being told is if they remain faithful and hold on to their faith, they will be taken through the most challenging and difficult of times. And Jesus will hold them. And even though for many of them, they will face enormous persecution, and many of them, of course, will go into the arena, and there they will be brutally murdered. They will do that, but they will be the victor, not those who carry out their brutalization. They will live forever, and one day they will go to be with Jesus. They overcame. What have they overcome? Well, I think they've overcome the fear of the first death. Death can be a very intimidating idea, and quite naturally at a human level, we're fearful of death, particularly if it happens to be very unpleasant or even brutal. But this does not stop them. This does not bind them in a way that disables them from continuing to faithfully live and love and serve Jesus. They will not allow that to happen. And because of that, they will be taken to be with Jesus. There will be no fear of a second death. The death of judgment, of course, will hold no fear for them, only for those who have fallen away. Smyrna, in material terms, was a very impoverished church. In spiritual terms, this church had riches that had been completely lost in the mother church in Ephesus.